So, the topic I will be talking about today is the Cold War spanning from the years 1945 to 1980. These are some key events that happened during the Cold War. The US uses atomic bombs on Japan to end World War II in 1945. This was used in an attempt to end the war in the Pacific without a costly invasion of Japan. The US dropped two atomic bombs on the Japan cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki on August 6th and 9th, 1945. One was a uranium gun-type atomic bomb named Little Boy, dropped on Hiroshima. The other was a plutonium implosion-type bomb named Fat Man, dropped on Nagasaki. The two atomic bombings ultimately ended Japan's involvement in World War II. However, this set the stage for the Cold War, with America and the Soviet Union being the two on the main stage. The Korean War, 1950 through 1953. Japan began ruling Korea in 1910, seceded control of Korea when it surrendered at the end of World War II. The US and USSR decided to split Korea into two occupation zones. The North Zone of the 38th parallel, occupied by the USSR. Koreans were living in a communist government. The US occupied the South and it oversaw elections and was a democratic government. The two major powers withdrew. Friction between North and the South erupted into war during 1950. North invaded South. Soon, US stepped to help in the South military, creating a proxy war between the US and the USSR. No final peace treaty was ever signed for this war, and to this day, they are still in an active war. The space race begins 1957. The US and USSR wanted to achieve technological superiority over the other. One way to gain that victory was to be the first country to build a rocket capable of launching an object into space. Not only would this prove immense technological achievement, it means that country would be powerful enough to carry a nuclear warhead capable of reaching the other country. On October of 1957, the Soviets launched Sputnik, the world's first artificial satellite. This completely caught the Americans off guard and immensely embarrassed them. The launch of this satellite made it apparent to the world that the USSR had the technology to attack the US with nuclear weapons. The US soon sent their own satellite into orbit on January 1958. Both countries were now in a race to reach the moon. The Vietnam War, 1959 through 1975. Vietnam, important sphere of influence by both the US and the Soviet leaders. Nationalists created North Vietnam in 1956. USSR and China backed the new communist country. The US was then committed to stopping the spread of communism in the region. Backed South Vietnam. As in Korea, US and USSR avoided direct warfare backed by opposing governments' forces. War was very unpopular in the U.S., withdrew last of the forces and aid to Vietnam in 1975. North Vietnam prevailed in the war. Vietnam was unified into Socialist Republic of Vietnam, 1976. Berlin Wall divides Germany. Massive number of East people in Berlin were fleeing through the open border to West Berlin. Late August 12th, Soviet Premier Khrushchev gave Eastern German government permission to stop the flow of immigrants by closing the border for good. Construction of the Berlin Wall on the border began on August 13th. First wall was made out of barbed wire and concrete block fence in just 2 weeks. The wall was more than 26 miles long. Wire fences were later replaced with a 13-foot wall of solid concrete. Cuban Missile Crisis, 1962. On October 16, 1962, U.S. President John F. Kennedy was briefed by the CIA that an American spy plane had taken photographs of Soviet nuclear missile launch sites under construction in Cuba. He then formed a group of advisors, Executive Committee, XCOM, to develop the U.S. response to this discovery. Over the course of the next 13 days, the Cuban Missile Crisis would unfold. This is the mark of the U.S. and Soviet Union being the closest they had ever been in the past to nuclear war. Hotline, established between U.S. and USSR in 1963. After the Cuban Missile Crisis, U.S. and USSR decided to set up a direct line between the two countries. This would allow rapid and direct communication between them in situations that might impact the security of both countries. It's commonly referred to as the red phone. The communication link was actually a teletypewriter that transmitted written messages, not voice. It was first used in 1967 during the Arab-Israeli War. It was for the U.S. to explain fleet movement in the Mediterranean. Able Archer and the War Scare, 1983. In early November of 1983, the world may have been closer to nuclear war than any other time since the Cuban Missile Crisis. NATO was conducting a routine exercise called Able Archer, a system designed to train and test the procedures for shifting from conventional nuclear war. Soviet Union misinterpreted this exercise as a prelude to the first strike by the U.S., also known as the War Scare of 1983. Many different reports were conducted in the following years that show the scare was very real for both countries, and there were reasons for concern. Berlin Wall comes down, 1989. June of 1987, U.S. President Ronald Reagan gave a speech that challenged the Soviet General Secretary to tear down the wall. Less than 18 months later, millions of Germans celebrated as thousands tore down the stone border wall. This is one of the most iconic and important images of the Cold War. Soviet Union collapses, end of the Cold War, 1991. Many of the leaders during 1989 after the collapse of the Berlin Wall were overthrown by popular uprisings. This caused the Soviet Union to slowly crumble and be in turmoil. Finally, on December 8, 1991, the Soviet Union finally collapsed. The president of the Russian Republic, Boris Yeltsin, formed the Commonwealth of Independent States. After 45 years, the longest war in U.S. history, the Cold War was officially over. These are some key people during the time of the Cold War. Allen Dulles, director of the CIA under Eisenhower, advocated extensive use of covert operations. Most notable initiatives were U.S.-sponsored coups in Iran, 1953, and Guatemala, 1954, install pro-American governments in order to curb potential expansion of communism. However, many of these coups proved to be rather transparent and caused international anger towards the U.S., one country being the Soviet Union. John Foster Dulles, Secretary of State under Eisenhower, brother of Allen Dulles, helped to devise Eisenhower's New Look policy. The policy emphasized massive retaliation with nuclear weapons. He also advocated for the use of nuclear weapons against Ho Chi Minh's communist. Dwight D. Eisenhower, former commander of NATO who became U.S. President in 1953. He expanded New Deal-era social welfare programs, Social Security, and passed the landmark Federal Highway Act. His New Look foreign policy emphasized the use of nuclear weapons against the Soviet Union in order to cut costs and deter the USSR from spreading communism. He also authorized CIA-sponsored coups in Iran and Guatemala. John F. Kennedy, 35th President of the U.S., elected in 1960, him and a member of his foreign member staff devised a tactic of flexible response to contain communism. He then sent military advisors to support South Vietnam during the Vietnam War. He also formed alliances for progress used to fight poverty and communism in Latin America. He also backed the disastrous Bay of Pigs invasion, ultimately led to the Cuban Missile Crisis. Nikita Khrushchev headed the Soviet Communist Party, leader of the USSR from 1958 through the 1960s. Americans hoped his rise to power would lead to reduction in Cold War tensions. He toured the U.S. in 1959 and visited with President Eisenhower at Camp David, Maryland. Party leaders in the Soviet Union were upset with him for having backed down during the Cuban Missile Crisis. They then removed him from power in 1964. Douglas MacArthur, Fifth Star American general who commanded Allied forces in the Pacific during World War II, commanded United Nations force in Korea, forcing North Korean forces back, making the brilliant Incan landing, ignored many Chinese warnings to approach the North Korean-China border, but ultimately did the opposite of these warnings and approached the border anyway. President Harry S. Truman later rejected MacArthur's request to bomb North Korea and China with nuclear weapons. After his public criticism of the president's decision, Truman removed him from his command in 1951. Joseph McCarthy capitalized on Cold War fears and communism in the early 1950s by accusing hundreds of government employees for being communist and Soviet agents. Although he failed to prove concrete evidence, many Americans still believed him. He ruined his reputation at the televised Harvey McCarthy hearings in 1954. Soon after the hearing, he received an official censure from the Senate and died in 1957. Laws and policies. Truman Doctrine. Britain could no longer support Greece in the war, so they withdrew troops. President Truman feared Greece would fall to communism without support. The Truman Doctrine put in place to support democracy around the world and help foreign nations. The Marshall Plan, a program the U.S. gave large amounts of economic aid to European countries, helped them rebuild after World War II. It was proposed by the U.S. Secretary of State General George C. Marshall. There are many goals wanting to be reached by this plan, some of which being to rebuild war-torn regions, remove trade barriers, and prevent the spread of communism. North Atlantic Treaty Organization. The U.S. and 11 European nations entered into the Collective Security Agreement, focused on collective defensive and the protection of its members from potential threats coming from the Soviet Union. National Security Act of 1947 reconstructed the nation's military by unifying the armed services, established the Central Intelligence Agency, and also established the National Security Council. McCarran Internal Security Act of 1950 required associations of the government considered communists to register with the government and submit information about membership, finances, and activities. Required registration of communist organizations in the U.S. Key institution in the era of the Cold War. Internal Security Emergency.
The significance of the Cold War was that it shaped American foreign policy, political ideology, domestic policy, and the presidency at the time. It resulted in anti-communist suspicions and internal conflicts, and a direct quote was that it split the temporary wartime alliance against the Nazi Germany, leaving the USSR and the US as two superpowers with profound economic and political differences over capitalism and democracy, relating back to Key Concept 8.2. So the impact of the Cold War on America was that politicians used anti-communist hysteria to campaign on a strong rightist platform, and the U.S. now supported corrupt and anti-democratic governments as long as they were friendly with America and didn't completely disagree with their views. Many people in the government and media were accused of being communists, and some were blacklisted, which is the Red Scare. And then Truman's hardline standing at Stalin put pressure on his admin, affecting many of the presidential acts at the time, and the Truman Doctrine changed U.S. foreign policy. And this relates back to the key concept of 8.2, because just going off the United States, policymakers engaged in a Cold War with the authoritarian Soviet Union with a goal to limit the growth of the communist military power and ideological influence create a free market global economy, and build an international security system. Going off what I said in the previous slide, the U.S. foreign policy during the war had main goals of containing the spread of communism, deterring a nuclear war, and supporting free trade and international economic institutions, whereas after the war, the main goals were to maintain U.S. global dominance, pursue free trade, still encourage democracy, and use military troops and equipment to support humanitarian missions, and to punish and isolate rogue states. And this related back to the key concept 8.3 because the war caused these political and economic changes impacting Americans' thoughts and opinions on government and politics. So both the social and economic impacts that the Cold War left on America relate back to the key concept of 8.3. Starting with the social impact the war left, it led to a regression of social reforms like civil rights, labor unions, working conditions, and women's concerns were minimized and often ignored. Overall, there was a pressure to conform in American society, but during the 50s and going into the 50s, literature started having themes of individualism. The American economy did have enormous growth, and it was mainly spurred by industries related to the war because they were aided by heavy government expansion. In America, poverty also declined, but between 1/5 to 1/4 of the nation couldn't survive on the income they earned.